From National Review headquarters in New York City, this is a Capital Writing editor interview. For the first time ever, we have not an author, but an editor of a book that is by an author who passed away many years ago. The book is called Government Project. It is by Edward Banfield, and the editor from the American Enterprise Institute is Kevin Kosar. Thank you so much, Kevin, for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. So I guess to start off, it would help to know who the author actually was. So, who is Edward Banfield?
Edward Banfield, he was a giant in both scholarship and in conservative thought. He lived from 1916 to 1999. He was a guy who grew up in Connecticut, modest stock, as they would have said back then. Went off to local college to study English and learn about journalism. And then he joined the New Deal, and he was writing press releases and doing PR for the Timber Salvage Administration, and then later he moved on to the Farm Security Administration. He was an ardent supporter of the various government interventions during the Great Depression. But in the course of being there, he saw this project, the government project, as he later called it, out in Casa Grande in Arizona, and Ed studied it, and then Ed went off to grad school at the U of Chicago, where he got his PhD and worked with luminaries like Leo Strauss and Frank Knight and various eminent sociologists. And later, he spent most of his career at Harvard, where he wrote a lot about urban politics and policy and American governance issues.
And so he's one of these conservatives who came out of the New Deal, which is sort of the opposite of what you might expect. Milton Friedman being another example of someone who worked for the government during the New Deal and then became an opponent of government intervention for much of the rest of his life after that. So Banfield, you mentioned he was in Arizona. He was looking at this farm that was run by the Farm Security Administration. Can you explain a little bit what the thought process was behind the New Deal planners for what they were trying to accomplish with this project in Arizona?
Yeah, sure. So various factors came together to create a kind of rural homelessness. One factor was the invention of the tractor. Well, what's a diesel tractor have to do with the eruption of poverty? Well, what it meant was that this expensive piece of machinery could be purchased by corporations, national corporations, who could use it to get a whole lot more crops, a whole lot better yield, lower labor costs. They need fewer people. It also leads to the creation of these kind of mega farms and the dying off of the smaller farms that couldn't compete because they couldn't reach the economies of scale and produce fruits, vegetables, and the like for lower prices. And we also had the Dust Bowl, very terrible thing in middle America, massive droughts, crops failing, farmers going broke. We had the Great Depression. A lot of stuff was coming together. And the FDR administration created something called the Resettlement Administration, and it was just done with the stroke of a pen. Didn't go through Congress, didn't get the legislators' blessing, and an offshoot of that was to create this government project out in Arizona. Originally, it was drawn up that they were going to make 40 small farms. So the government acquired a whole bunch of land and they started to create irrigation for it, build housing for it. But then they realized that each of these farms was doomed to fail because they couldn't compete with the corporate size farm. So then they said, well, let's get these people instead to farm their own mega farm cooperatively. And we will take people who have, only the shirt on their back and a few paltry possessions, and we're going to give them the world. They'll get nice new houses, they'll get yards. We'll have a whole community that will build for them. They'll get a paying wage job, pretty much guaranteed work every single day. They'll get an equity stake in this larger cooperative farm. And so that's what they set up around 1937. And the farm lasted about 7 years before the settlers walked away.
And as you said, these were people that were in real poverty. This was, these houses that were on the project. They had running water and electricity, and for these people, that was in many cases the first time in their lives that they had those things. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There were people who were living in shacks who had built the shacks out of taking tin cans, cutting them, and then hammering them flat, and then tacking them together. I mean, these were desperately poor people. I mean, kids, they had stunted growth and things like rickets from insufficient nutrition. Um, it was yeah, these were people who showed up in Arizona because they were migrating. They were just trying to find an opportunity somewhere.
So obviously, there were many poor people during the Great Depression. So the government had to do some kind of process to select which people were going to be in this project in Arizona. How did they go about choosing which families and which people to include?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, but it was essentially boiled down to a woman with a clipboard conducting interviews and trying to screen people just to see if they seemed like they were nice. Um, did they have an inherent interest in cooperation? If they did, well, gosh, then they would get more points on their application. They wanted to know if how many family members they have. If you showed up and you had 18 people with you, then you were probably not right for the project. They wanted smaller families. So there's a variety of criteria that they use to try to screen people. Do you have any experience farming? Do you have a consistent work history period, or are you a potential layabout who may not be right for this sort of thing? Personal hygiene, that was also a consideration for some of the applicants. So they had a whole range of things, but it amounted to a lady with a clipboard just trying to do her best to screen families in. And initially, the trick was to get enough people there so that they could start getting this enterprise up and running. Not least because there was this element of legal compliance because they were incorporating it. This wasn't just a government agency owning the land. Rather, the government agency created a cooperative corporation under Arizona law. And by law, it had to have a certain number of directors to be chosen from its members. Therefore, you had to get members in the door to be able to incorporate it and get it up and running.
Yeah, that was one of the peculiar things that about it as I was reading through. Obviously, this was a federal project, and a big part of the New Deal was centralizing power at the federal level. But the Arizona government and even the county government were involved in various aspects of this project, not necessarily in cooperation with the federal government, but in many cases as a defense for people against the federal government.
Yeah, yeah. Unlike the Soviets, the FDR administration, when it came to farming, didn't go into full-on collectivization. They took a couple steps towards it, but ultimately they were not trying to have federally run and operated and owned farms. They were trying to use federal power to kind of counter capitalism's development and to counter the troubles of the Great Depression and all that to create some sort of viable industry. And cooperatism was a kind of broader movement that was in the air, particularly amongst the smart set who advised FDR back in those days. I mean, you go around Washington, D.C. today, or particularly New York City, you'll find apartment buildings that aren't condominiums, they're cooperatives. Well, they were born out of that same movement about 100 years ago, where the idea is that you give people who live in a place an equity stake in it, and then what flows from that is they get the right to have some democratic control over it. They get to vote as members and pick a board of directors, and the board of directors gets to hire the person who actually manages the place. I actually live in a cooperative here in Washington, D.C. apartment. So that firsthand experience I've had with them reminds me, and I can share with all, it is a very fraught model, which combines both economic imperatives with democratic political ideals, which do not sit easily together.
Sure, sure. So one of the things about the way Banfield tells this story is that, as you said, he was there for parts of it, so he has firsthand knowledge. He talked directly to people who were involved in the project, but he also goes through the archival records from the federal government in San Francisco, which was sort of the office that was running this project, sort of distantly from Arizona, and then they were reporting back to Washington. Um, uh, when he tells his story, though, he tells it with there's a story arc in the book. It's not just sort of a dry historical account. He really kind of makes it a narrative. And at the beginning, when you have very poor people who, for the first time, as we said before, have running water, electricity, a stable roof over their head. At the start, it seemed pretty promising, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Once they got enough bodies on the farm, they were able to get things up and running, and the people were generally with it, and they were doing the jobs, and in part they were. The situation was aided greatly by the presence of the first kind of foreman or manager to oversee the place. It was a guy with the last name of Fall, Faul, and he was a kind of old school private sector tyrannical sort of boss. He wasn't evil. He just was, my word is the law, and you shall obey. And if you don't, I'll kick you off the farm. And so he came in with a very firm hand and basically bossed people around and told them exactly what to do. And the people just initially kind of complied. Although it's true, a faction of them who had heard this idea of cooperation got their hands on a copy of the bylaws. And they, during a rainy day, went out to the dairy barn and read the bylaws. And the bylaws said that they were supposed to, have an equity stake in this, that they were supposed to vote. And so they took a vote amongst themselves to appoint their own manager, not Fall, some other guy that they liked. The FSA, the government very quickly shot them down. Fall came on them like a load of bricks, and this kind of incipient democratic eruption was crushed and kept under control for a couple of years. And then the farm, it was prospering. It was uneven prospering. Different things worked better. But on the whole, the place was actually covering its operating costs.
And you used a word that was very important, which is faction, because we see in this book, and Banfield describes how factions arise very quickly, even in this very small group of people, relatively small group of people. Usually faction, when we talk about it, when James Madison talks about it in the Federalist Papers, he's talking about it in an entire country. But this is just one farm. But because it is a democratic system, or at least it's supposed to be, right away you have people who, very much like we saw in the early United States, are pro administration or pro government, or anti administration or anti government, and those two factions show up, and then conflict ensues from there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the premise of cooperatism and the premise, you could even go further, is say of kind of collectivism and the Sovietism, is an assumption about human egalitarianism that people are basically all the same and they can be persuaded to adopt a similar worldview, and everybody can just kind of get in line and it'll be fine. And no, it won't be fine. People are different. They're partial. They very quickly separate amongst themselves into groups. That's the brute fact of pluralism. People organize these groups. Birds of a feather will flock together. And yeah, out at the farm, groups very quickly formed. Part of it was a class line thing. There were people who were just super impoverished migrant farm workers, much less education, maybe only a couple of years, often couldn't read. These are people who kind of lived moving place to place, just picking on corporate farms. Um, some of them have never seen a flush toilet before. And then there were other farmers at Casa Grande who, had experienced a little bit of a better life, and they'd been in urban areas. And, these groups looked at each other and very quickly kind of made a qualitative distinction between them, particularly with those, the non Oki group, looking down upon the others. Banfield also cites that all of these people were more or less, to some degree, individualistic. They were people who didn't want to be on the dole. They didn't want to be taking government largesse. They were, to some degree, thankful for it, but they were also resentful. And this stew of emotions led to them, or fed into the factionalism, where some of them were like, I want to get close to the FSA people who are overseeing this so I can influence them and exert power that way. And others broke into a faction who were just like, anti FSA, fight the power. It was a very remarkable thing. Very small number of people who had all come from desperate situations, but once they had enough food to eat and houses to live in, um, moved into politicking.
Madison in the Federalist Papers says one way to mitigate that problem of faction is to expand and make the polity bigger. But obviously, this is one farm, so that's not really an option. And so there was not really a way to deal with that factionalism. You mentioned too, talking about the Okies, who were these, these more migrant farmers. Some of them from Oklahoma, but some of them just from other places as well. And then there were people who were actually from Arizona that were there too, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and that was another line of factionalism amongst them. And I should say, with regard to the kind of politicking that erupted, um, what Banfield saw there was kind of proof of the old sociological insight of Robert Michel, which is the iron law of oligarchy. When it comes to politicking and governance stuff, the average person is not going to have much appetite, time, or desire to be involved with that. They're going to spend their time otherwise and mostly be spectators and a kind of occasionally will cling on to things like during campaigns. Meanwhile, the self-motivated elites are the ones who tend to do the politicking. And we still see this in modern America today. We see that in the Soviet Union, who are the leaders of the party versus who are the ones who are just kind of nominal members. Not everybody's into this sort of politics stuff and governance stuff. And so at Casa Grande, you had a rump of people who were fighting the FSA. You had a rump of people who wanted to get close to it and try to direct it. And they were tearing each other's hair out. And then, the rest of the people were kind of on the sideline, occasionally aligning with one side or the other. But it resulted in the kind of regular elections switching the leadership of the board from one faction to the other faction back and forth, which was very destabilizing.
And the Soviet solution to that problem of disengagement or lack of interest in democratic process was, well, we need to create the new Soviet man, and once we create the new Soviet man, then they will all understand, and then we'll be able to make this utopia work. Uh, the Roosevelt administration didn't go that far, but they did have a lot of conversations about the need for education and the need for we need to teach these people how to make cooperatives work. And if only we did that, then they would be able to make the farm prosper. But Banfield says that that's not the right way to go.
Yeah, he essentially thought it was a fool's errand. That setting aside the inherent contradiction between the kind of imperatives of cooperativism and self-rule versus running an economically viable farm, which means things like sometimes you have to shed labor, which means kicking people out of the community if you're in a cooperative because it's not economically efficient. So setting that stuff aside, um, yeah, you're dealing with human beings whose entire life experiences made them individualists. They wanted to stand on their own 2 feet. They dreamt of having their own farms. Even if they knew that having their own farm probably would lead them to ruin, they wanted to give it a go. And so the idea that you could just reason with them and you could educate them enough to kind of get past this worldview and become, happy, placid members of the Casa Grande community who would just cooperate and go along and eventually develop enough professional expertise to take control of the farm and to do the finances and all that. It was a lot of wishful thinking.
And uh, one of the things that Banfield finds, as you said, is this individualism among these people. And a lot of times, more collectivist projects are undertaken in the name of the poor, in the name of helping to alleviate poverty. But he seems to say that these people, as you just said, because of their experience with poverty, actually had a more individualistic outlook on the world. And part of that problem too is that a lot of them were under the impression at the start of the project when they were selected that uh, the original intent of the program, which was to have 40 small farms, was actually going to be what was carried out. And then they sort of felt a little bit of a bait and switch on it, right?
Yeah, that's true. They absolutely did. At one point in the book, Banfield cites a guy who's kind of railing about the lack of freedom, and he gives a simple example of, if you're running your own farm and one day, 4 o'clock, you decide, I'm just tired of working. I want to take my wife into town and go see a movie. You can do that. And whatever cost is related to that, you're going to bear. If you have to stay up later to take care of the animals because you didn't do it earlier in the evening, well, that's on you. Uh, at Casa Grande, you couldn't do that, or you had to go hat in hand to somebody and ask permission, which of course would raise questions about, well, if you're not working for these hours, do you get paid wages for those hours? Um, and yeah, people people wanted to stand on their own 2 feet. People want to do their own thing, and they just had a hard time believing in this kind of chimerical vision of there was going to be some sort of freedom and self development and the pursuit of their own kind of journey in life on this kind of almost aquarium like development where you're just kind of stuck within these narrow bounds, and you may have all the food you need and you may have all the shelter you need, you may have remarkable comfort, but still it wasn't satisfying. And it kind of, is that old chunk of wisdom, man doesn't live by bread alone. Just feeding them is not enough. And that was a great theme in like Dostoevsky and a lot of the dissident writers, for all the promises the Soviets were making about how we're taking care of you and you no longer have to worry about poverty. Never mind, that was often a lie, but even if they had been successful, people still wouldn't have been happy.
And you mentioned that farmer who was talking about, he couldn't go see a movie with his wife if he wanted to. And Banfield records that guy talking at length. It goes on for a couple of pages, and it's really it reads like just like a rant of him basically saying why he thinks this project is terrible. And what was remarkable about it is, and this is what I really appreciated about the way that Banfield tells this story, is that you know especially for free market conservatives, like we're pretty familiar with the arguments against government planning, with the inefficiencies that come about, with the huge allocation problems that happen when you don't have price signals and all the rest of this. And we sort of get this on a theoretical level, but in that guy's rant, you're reading the actual real life consequences of this. And he's this is someone who, as we said before, is not well educated. He has not read Hayek. He's not doing any of this, right? But when you read what he's saying, it's exactly what you would predict if you have read Hayek, and if you have an understanding of free market economics, and then you look through and you say, oh, this is exactly what is happening because the Farm Security Administration has said that we're not going to let the laws of economics run, and we're going to try to one up it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the trade-offs that keeps coming up is the people who drew up this plan. Uh, they had a goal of let's put people to work, men in particular, and let's keep them steadily employed because it's bad to have idle hands. Oh, okay, that's all well and fine. But by the way, we also want this farm to be efficient, and we want it to be able to cover its operating costs and preferably profit. Okay, well, very early on, you have farmers coming up and saying, look, hand milking the cows is silly. We have machines. Let's acquire these machines, and we're not going to need nearly as many people. And in the long run, it's going to be cheaper, more efficient. We'll clear greater money. And they were fired. The boss at the time told them no, and get out. Some of them were later hired back on, but how do you square that? You can't. That's just one of the many inherent tensions that were baked into it. And yeah, the whole management structure. What should management look like? How do you have managers who work for the people that they're ultimately bossing around, who they're trying to tell to do things that they may not want to do? Like some jobs are more glorious than others. I mean, to be a foreman and get to drive around in a pickup truck and kind of keep an eye on other people instead of standing out in the hot baking sun and picking cotton and getting your knuckles all bloody, like there are clear status differences in the jobs, and management has to make those decisions about where people go. But at the same time, the manager is supposed to be answerable to these people. Um, Not easy to square that either. But yeah, that fellow's rant was really something. But at core, he kept saying like, "Well, this place could be better run if this was changed or that was changed or something else was changed." But he kept circling back to the fact of, "But ultimately, I'd just rather have my own farm."
Yeah, yeah, it was ultimately about property rights, right? He's ultimately saying, "Look, nobody owns this thing. This is frustrating. I wish I could own it, because then I would know how to take care of it."
Yeah,
Um,
the whole project had this idea of you were going to take democratic man, this aspect of the American citizen who is the person who picks who gets to operate the government, and we're going to take that model and impose it on the economy and create a democratic economic man. And it's just inherently contradictory.
And the other thing that Banfield mentions too is that the assumption from the Roosevelt people was that people would always be economically rational too, and that everything in that and it was this egalitarian concept that people are just interchangeable. They all have sort of predictable rational impulses that we know how that works, and so if we just set the conditions right, we'll get the result that we want. And Banfield says, no, you're forgetting about things like you mentioned about status, right? And you're forgetting that's something that people want too, even if it's not always economically rational. And so, yeah, you get these situations where the government's the project is proposing these make work things in order to keep people from being idle, but really, they're just hurting the economic rationality of it. But then they're also messing with the status desires that people want, who say, "Look, I've worked hard on this. I should get a promotion. I should be able to have a higher position." And you're not doing that in the name of equality, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, these people were in a kind of almost like a little North Korean bubble or something. At one point, one of the parents there says, there's no opportunity for the kids here, and that's absolutely correct. If people make more people, but there's not more work to go around, then what are these guys going to do? And so you end up with these sort of make work things. And then people recognize that it's make work and they don't want to do it and they're offended by it. Their dignity is harmed. And interestingly, Banfield details how, some of the jobs, some of the tougher jobs like picking cotton, the longer people worked on the farm, the less they wanted to do it. They increasingly thought it was beneath them. And so the farm started importing migrants and employing them and having them stay in crummy shacks on the property and having them seasonally pick the cotton. And that raised the question of, well, wait a minute, are these people equal to us? If so, they deserve better houses. They deserve to be full members and have equity stakes. But if we do that, we're going to dilute our own stakes and we don't need them year round. So what do we do with them? And so the whole kind of contrived bubble that was this farm kept breaking down of its own internal contradictions, but just due to the basic economic forces at work.
There's an episode early on too. We should say that all the people were paid the same wage, so they had $60 per month, which at that time actually was a pretty good wage for a farmer
Mm-hmm.
in that part of the country. And so they paid them $60 a month, and people were happy with this initially. Then they called everybody together, and they said, "We're not reducing your wages, but we're going to start deducting rent from your wages." And that's going to be $8 a month, and so you're only going to end up having $52 of take-home pay.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not cutting your wages. That was the argument from the government, but all of the people understood this to be a wage cut, and they said, "Look, why are you guys cutting our wages? The whole point of this was that we were supposed to all be equal, and this was supposed to be a project of uplift. Why are we doing this?" And this was another example of they had these expectations of what it was going to look like, and then the government changed that on the fly, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, and they just simply it was simply announced. It was not a matter that the settlers were consulted upon. They didn't certainly didn't have a vote on it. It was, this is the way the numbers are going to have to work in order to make this thing viable for this year. So we're going to have to make this change. And the people resented that. And yeah, one of the themes that runs throughout the book is, one of the lessons is the that understanding wealth is not an easy thing. a lot of the settlers were very focused on wage. Wage is really what your wealth was. And so the fact that they were getting this really nice housing, which was a clear material benefit, and of course they were not being taxed on it, as you would today, perhaps. Once they got that and got used to it, it kind of got baked into their operating assumptions. And the idea that you were building an equity stake that actually had monetary value due to your duration in service and number of hours you were working and that sort of stuff, that's an abstraction. And a lot of the settlers didn't get that either. So they got very hung up on the idea of the wage being what everything was about. And then this whole rift broke out between people who were of the attitude of we should raise the wage as soon as we possibly can. And then there are others who are like, well, we should wait and see if we have a profit at the end of the year, and then we can distribute the profit. And that, either way, it's more money in your pocket. And they just philosophically couldn't agree on that. Some were much more short term, saying we should get the money now and take what we can get. Others were more cautious, saying, well, what if we don't profit this year? We could actually be underwater, and then we have to take another wage cut. Uh, yeah, uh, the difficult thing.
Yeah, yeah, and there was no price signals in order to figure out how to solve these problems because in a market economy, there would be price signals where we would know how much it communicates the demand for things relative to the supply. It communicates for a wage scale. It communicates the value added by the work that's being done. So people who are doing those higher status things would probably get paid more, and then and people picking the cotton would be paid less. And that would help to solve this problem, right? But in the absence of that, the government had to just kind of tough it out. I mean, there was really not a viable alternative to that, despite the best efforts of the Roosevelt administration to get it to work.
Yeah, I mean, you had a single firm which was trying to do everything that an entire economy could do. Um, if you were an employee at some organization and you're saying to yourself, I want a higher hourly wage, and I'm not really interested in the sort of other compensation benefits. I don't need a 401k or whatever. Well, you can ask your boss for a raise, and the boss says no. You can go to another firm. Well, the people of Casa Grande, they were out there kind of on this island of sorts. They'd taken the desert land and turned it into a farm. And yeah, they could get into town, but it was the Great Depression. You had no guarantee of being able to find work elsewhere. Also, the case of, all right, let's imagine the workers on the farm are all striving hard and they're trying to learn more and up their skills. Where could they move up to on the farm? You can only have so many foremen. You could have only have so many people who are doing, the higher yield labor. It's just baked into the model. There's just not enough room unless there's some sort of boom in demand for the product, and need more people to take care of the cows or more people to be foremen. There's just a built-in cap. But then again, where do people go? Um, there's nowhere to go. So people got mad. They got frustrated. Some did walk away, which is an astonishing thing that baffled people in Washington, D.C. You know, you had hardly anything before. We gave you everything, yet you got frustrated and you walked away. That just was not in their calculations in Washington, D.C.
And the lead guy in Washington D.C. who was sort of oversaw this whole thing was Rexford Tugwell, who was the sort of the director of all sorts of agricultural projects as part of the New Deal, working for Franklin Roosevelt. And one of the peculiar things about this book, which is about the failure of one of these farm projects, is that Rexford Tugwell wrote the foreword for Banfield's original book. How did that come about, and why did he do that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, so Banfield was working for FSA, which is a creature of the Resettlement Administration run by Rex Tugwell. Um, as Banfield went and did his research on the farm, and he certainly shared some of his observations with Tugwell and his team. And at that time, Resettlement Administration was being zeroed out, gotten rid of by Congress. And so Tugwell went off to the University of Chicago and invited Ed Banfield to come along and be a graduate student, and to continue his thinking about the farm and kind of uh, policy and planning and all sorts of stuff related to governance. And so Ed went along, and yeah, that was his. What became Government Project was originally his dissertation, and he was in communication with Tugwell, who was a kind of a not a professor, but way up in the university hierarchy there. And Tugwell saw real merit in the work, and bless Rex's heart to actually be willing to write the thing and to say, there are lessons to be learned from this experience for all of us.
Yeah, one question is whether he really did learn them, though, because then he went off during World War II to Puerto Rico and basically repeated the same centralization project, and is actually in large part responsible for a lot of the problems that are still in Puerto Rico, um, in terms of just economic issues they have there and centralization of government. Um, so overall, though, how was this book received at the time? This came out in 1951, right? So this was after World War II. This was sort of, the New Deal was over at that point, so there would have been probably a little bit more reception to uh, critique of it than maybe there would have been when it was going on. And people might have been a little bit more even-minded about it. Was that the case, or was it still the case that was Banfield seen as kind of a sort of a one-off critic of this great program that overall still had a positive impact?
Uh, it's not clear how many copies of the book were published and sold. Interestingly, it was published not with a university publisher, but with a trade publisher, Glen Cove, New York. And they sent out press release, and New York Times gave the book a brief mention. But the only reviews I was able to dig up for this book were in academic journals, and I assume that was Banfield letting the various people he had met in the sociology and the farm policy worlds in academia know about the book, and the book was very favorably reviewed. But it was unusual insofar as it was a case study, and it was a case study that exhibited the fact that Banfield was not locked into kind of one academic methodology for doing things. He drew upon sociology, he drew upon history, he drew upon economics, public administration. His journalistic style meant that the book did not read like a typical academic book. Um, he when he got his PhD, he was 36 years old, which was quite aged, both then and today for getting a PhD. And so Banfield had a lot to draw upon, not least his own real world experience. There's political philosophy in there. I mean, Durkheim, the sociologist, gets cited. I mean, there's a lot going on in there, and I think not many readers were entirely sure what to do with this. Um, wasn't exactly a book written for the popular masses, but it's not also one that fit into kind of a neat canon for any particular strain of academia. So it got favorable mention, and then it was forgotten, particularly as Banfield went on and wrote other books that got a lot of attention.
And like I said as well, you mentioned this was his dissertation originally, and it doesn't read like that at all. It reads, like there's a narrative arc to it. There's a sort of a rise and fall of the Casa Grande farm, right? Just the way he tells the story, and then he sort of wraps it up at the end with, like you said, these like very uh, uh, interdisciplinary observations about how about the problems that were on the farm, and really broadening it out to a general sociological, economic, political perspective, in a way that a lot of people probably haven't done. Is that one of the reasons that you think this book is important to read now? And also, uh, how has this book been received? Well after its publication, but sort of living on at the American Enterprise Institute specifically, but also just among in conservative circles in Washington D.C. in general.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to get more conservatives to pick it up. There's a small and decreasing number of people who were students of Ed. Um, that's just a natural passage of time and the passage of human lives. So many of Banfield's students did not go on to be in academia. They went out and worked in the private sector. And because they did that, what it meant is that they were not producing their own students who were trained in reading Banfield. And so the number of people who read Banfield these days in the course of their graduate studies has gone down, down, down. So republishing this book is an effort in part to, A, tell people this is a great book and you'll enjoy it. B, there's a lot of wisdom in this, and C, restore Ed Banfield to, the center of conservative thinking about politics, economics, and governance. And yeah, he was. Gosh, what can you say about his way of approaching things? It's super valuable reading this book, not only because it sets you up to understand all his other bigger books like Politics, Planning in the Public Interest, and The Unheavenly City, and The Moral Basis of a Backward Society. These are huge books still worth reading. But it also is a great vehicle for teaching people how to think clearly. I think now it's very, very easy for people to just grab an ideology or worldview or quick opinion off the shelf and use it to look at the world. It's the wonder of technology and the wonders of Twitter or X. Um, Banfield shows us that, if you really want to understand things, you have to get out and look at them firsthand. You got to burn the shoe leather. You got to get into the muck. You got to talk to the people, talk to them, try to understand why is it that this person and this person can look at what appears to be the same collection of facts and feel absolutely different about it. And that's what he spent a lot of time doing in Government Project, is really not judging people so much. It's just trying to understand them to explain the kind of ultimate tragedy of this project. And I think we'd all be better for doing more of that.
And Government Project, as you mentioned, is one of his first books, and he had these other ones that created a much bigger stir. On the Heavenly City is probably the most notable, right? I think that's probably the one he's best known for. And for people who think that cancel culture or whatever is brand new, Banfield was sort of canceled as well, right? In terms of the way that progressives received his book and his criticisms of urban policy. Um, uh, what do you think? Was this part of the reason as well that fewer people were reading Banfield as an effort by progressives just to say we don't need to pay attention to him?
Oh yeah, certainly, certainly. I mean, Ed, initially, you would have thought that he would have been the darling of people on the left. Um, One of his early books was Politics, Planning in the Public Interest, and he was waving his hands then, saying, hey, I've got a book length study here that shows that this effort at urban renewal, that's being sold as a way to help the poor in cities, but in fact, it's not helping them. It's actually making their ideas objectively worse. And there are all sorts of unpleasant interests at work there. There are people who want the land that these slummy areas exist upon and want to drive these people off the land and put them somewhere else where the land is cheaper and less valued so that they can take it and redevelop it. You would think saying things like that would endear him. You would think that for those who were at the time kind of attacking the nuclear family, his study of the, the city in rural Italy, more of a village than anything else, in the moral basis of backward society, where he said that, like all things in life, if taken to extremes, a good thing can be bad. And there, the good thing was people caring about their families was taken to such an extreme that they didn't trust people outside the family. So their ability to cooperate and to produce wealth and to self-govern was crippled by it. You would have thought that people on the left would have loved that, but no, they latched on to the unheavenly city, um, and they raged about it, and they canceled Ed because they were upset that he was heaping cold water on the various big liberal reforms of the day. The narrative that was being put out by the media and the universities were that, the inner cities are inflamed because these people have been victimized, and so we just have to do a lot of redistribution. That's the nut of it in the simplest form. And Ed was like, well, wait a minute, it's more complex than that. The whole cities are not in flames. Not everything is bad. Some things are bad, but some of these things that are bad are not going to be readily amenable by public policy. It's about people making choices in their lives and uh, having worldviews that just run contrary to what we would hope for. And yeah, Ed was actually chased out of Harvard. He was so harassed, and he had one student who was actually stalking him, that he switched and went to the University of Pennsylvania. And this crazy student followed him to the University of Pennsylvania after she was thrown out of Harvard and harassed him there. And after a couple of years of that, he said, the heck with that," and he went back to Harvard and finished out his career there. But yeah, he was turned into a pariah by the left.
Hmm. and and this is probably part of the reason too that he sort of the reaction to the reaction is that he becomes a hero at the American Enterprise Institute, right? Which is also full of lots of people who were chased out of universities for their conservative views, but were still very good scholars and still had a lot to contribute academically.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I'm still trying to trace it out, but Ed got connected with AEI very early on. I think the first thing he wrote for AEI was around 1960, 61, 62, something like that, on foreign aid. It's called Foreign Aid Doctrines, and where he basically takes a look at the various justifications offered for foreign aid, and he raises pointed questions about them. Um, and yeah, he had a whole series of kind of interactions with AEI, but perhaps the most significant one that cemented him to AEI was one of his students was Christopher Demuth, who became the head of AEI in the 80s, and really built it into a powerful think tank here in Washington D.C. They were very close to each other. One of Ed's students, Bruce Kovner, uh, he was another PhD student who decided not to go the academia route, and so he went into finance and became a hedge fund guy and a market wizard, as he was later deemed by a book. And Ed became or Bruce became a long family friend to Ed and his wife Laura, but also became a supporter of AEI, who helped fund AEI and helps provide advice on governance. So, yeah, the AEI connection is long, that's for sure.
And that's why the new book is out. It's called Government Project. It's from AEI Press. It is a new edition of this book. It's very well put together, very very easy to read with a helpful introduction from Kevin that explains some of the background on it and why the book is important. So, encourage you to check it out. Again, Government Project by Edward Banfield. The editor is Kevin Kosar. Thanks, Kevin, for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.